Hey everybody, this is Stephanie Rupert. Thank you for tuning in to the Meaning of Everything podcast, where we entertain actually genius ideas. Today is episode number 24, and I have on Sheldon Solomon, who is a leading terror management theorist, which means that he looks at all the ways that death impacts the way that we function. Okay, so this is a set of really big ideas that I want to talk about today, or very important ideas. People who have been listening to this podcast for a while, or who simply have heard me tell my story, provide a little bit of background about my story, know that death has been central to my understanding of myself and our world for a very long time. I began having panic attacks about death when I was very young, was always deeply concerned with it. I think about it all the time, not in a particularly morbid way, but I'm always aware. Consciously. Now, Sheldon Solomon, and he'll tell this story in the interview, after the publication of a book called The Denial of Death in the 70s, Sheldon Solomon recognized some of his colleagues recognized the importance of the insights in this book about how important death is to our psychology. It affects everything that we do. And so he decided to do a lot of studies to prove it. And the things that he came up with, again, he'll talk about them, so I won't go over it now, but they basically have been able to pretty firmly establish that death lies at the core of our psychology and really, again, influences the way that we think about ourselves, about our world, how open-minded we are, how confident we are, how anxious we are, all these sorts of things. And so it's a very, very important set of ideas, and something that is hard to look at, but very important to look at. And we'll talk about that in the interview as well. You know, it's not a very easy set of ideas to sit with, no matter what your beliefs are about the afterlife. You know, the fact that we die it's scary. It's arguably, for a lot of people, the scariest thing. And for many people, they say it's not the scariest thing, but it still is the scariest thing. And there are many people who do have a sense of acceptance about death, but that's either very hard won or a little bit fake, or not something that is probed at very often, you know, because you don't want to upset it. So there's definitely a lot there, to be unpacked. And Sheldon and I talk for a while. He's very entertaining. A couple of things, just so you know a little bit about Sheldon. He is currently a professor at Skidmore University in upstate New York, which is a fantastic school and location. I highly recommend checking it out. And he is the co-author of The Worm at the Core, which is a book that was recently published precisely about all of these insights that he has unearthed over the course of the last few decades, studying how death impacts our decision-making, our religious views, our political views, all that sort of stuff. So the book is definitely worth checking out. I will put it in the show notes. And again, or you can just Google it right now and go buy it immediately, because it's fantastic. A quick reminder, you can find show notes at my website if you go to stephanierupert.com. Their most recent episodes are right there on the homepage, or you just go to podcast and it's all right there. So do check all of that out. I already recorded the interview with Sheldon, and it went really, really great. And I loved listening to everything he had to say and learning from what he had to say. A brief caveat, he does definitely call Donald Trump some not nice things. I happen to think he's correct. For those of you who may take offense to that, just walk into the insights with an open mind and listen, I think, closely to the psychological stuff that we're talking about, we're gesturing to while we're talking about these ideas that are really important. You know, there are things I have noticed. I won't talk about this for too long, but I lose followers every time I say something about Donald Trump, and I'm okay with that. But the thing is I'm more than willing to discuss these things rationally and calmly and considerately, and I'm not kicking any, by expressing the fact that I think Donald Trump is a narcissist as a psychological opinion. It's not, again, I'm not making any sort of condemnation about people who voted for him or what have you. And I want to be able to discuss these things. So please, if you've got an issue, just raise it and we'll talk about it. Don't necessarily just block me and think I'm evil or whatever. And I have, I think, demonstrated that I don't like to sit really firmly along partisan lines. That's not something that I'm interested in. And you can listen to my podcast number 18X on the discourse around political correctness and free speech, which I think is really important if you want to understand a little bit about how I am not allied with the left, so to say. So to speak in any particular way. I really like intellectual dialogue and nuance. And this is all an aside. My conversation with Sheldon is very long. So I'm going to get right into it. Here we are. Here is Sheldon Solomon. Hi, Sheldon. Welcome. How are you doing?
Very well, Stephanie, and thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I was just actually I was just telling somebody about how terror management theory exists, like they didn't know. And that's always surprising to me that it took us so long to figure out how important death is to us.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. On the one hand, we've been aware of it vaguely or not so vaguely since the birth of our species. And so some people argue that, what marks the transition to Homo sapiens sapien was becoming sufficiently aware of death to realize that was not a particularly welcome state of affairs. And so, the philosophers, the theologians, people sitting on the floor of a cave many tens of thousands of years ago, were poignantly and painfully aware of the reality of the human condition. But, and at the risk of sounding silly, the psychologists are always the last one to come around. The philosophers get it, theologians get it, the artists, the playwrights and poets get it. And then, a psychologist will say, oh, I have an idea, as if it's the first time that it's ever arisen. Having said that, though, I think it's quite understandable that, given the work that we do, based on Ernest Becker's efforts, particularly in his book, The Denial of Death, his point is that death is so potentially catastrophically unpleasant that we go to extraordinary lengths to pretend that it either doesn't exist or it doesn't bother us. And so for that reason, it's not great for scoring debate points with fellow academic psychologists. But when you say, oh, I think that the awareness of death is important, the most common response from psychologists and even people on the street is, well, I don't think about death that much, and therefore it can't be consequential. And it's not helpful when you say, well, you don't think about death that much because you're repressing it. So you either agree with me that it's important or you disagree, in which case you're repressing it. So am I right or am I right? That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, that's a fun way to put it. So what got you sort of onto this? Was this something you had been thinking about your whole life? It's something I was obsessed with my whole life, right? Or was it spurred on by reading Ernest Becker's book?
Yeah, both. So I have a profoundly personal interest in these matters, given that, like you, I very early on, I was 8 years old and my grandmother died. And I remember my mom saying the night before, say goodbye to grandma because she's not going to be around. And, I was very sad that my grandmother had died, but I distinctly remember sitting there and I had a stamp collection. So I was looking at old stamps of dead American presidents. And I was like, oh, my grandmother's dead and that saddens me. And then I'm like, oh, but wait a minute, that means my mother's gonna eventually get old and die. And I was like, wow, who's gonna make me dinner? And I was like, okay, I get over that. I'll go out. And then literally it hit me, like a psychological nuclear explosion. I'm like, oh, And that means that this too will befall me at some vaguely unspecified future moment. And I don't think I've ever been the same. I literally was terrified. And so I've been vaguely aware throughout my childhood and young adulthood that I wasn't a big fan of dying. And then I got a job at Skidmore College in 1980. And to make a short story long, I was just wandering through the library looking for books written by Freud when I saw Ernest Becker's The Birth and Death of Meaning, The Denial of Death, and Escape from Evil sitting right next to each other. And I thought those were interesting titles. And I read first The Birth and Death of Meaning, where in the first paragraph, Becker says, oh, I want to understand, I think he said something like, I want to understand why people do what they do when they do it. And I'm like, yeah, me too. And then in the Denial of Death, where he just says that the uniquely human awareness of death gives rise to potentially debilitating existential terror, and that in turn, how we manage that terror influences everything that people do, whether we're aware of it or not. I'm like, wow, that resonated so much with me. Mm-hmm. That it changed the course of my academic as well as my personal life. I was trained as an experimental social psychologist, but with no background in these matters. And so I was like, oh, I'm not going to do what I used to do. I'm going to study this. And so that's basically how we got involved.
Right. And what you managed to do for this study of death, this terror management theory, was actually prove, insofar as anything can be proved, was to actually prove that these things are real, right? Because for Becker, they were almost like hypotheses, they were philosophical premises, but you said, well, you know what, let's put some people in some studies, and you've done so many studies.
Yeah, that's right. So what happened is, yes, you've got it, Stephanie. So Becker says, in order to manage existential terror, that we embrace culturally constructed belief systems that he calls cultural worldviews, and that what those beliefs do is to manage death anxiety by giving us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. Mm-hmm. And moreover, what Becker argued is that if you're lucky enough to believe that you're a person of value in a world of meaning, that's what he calls self-esteem. And then in his books, he describes how that brings out both the best and the worst in us. And he won a Pulitzer Prize for the Denial of Death, but he couldn't get a job in the U.S. or in North America. He was denounced as kind of an entertaining lecturer of undergraduate students. And the ideas were also dismissed as interesting but vague philosophical / psychodynamic speculation for which there is no evidence, nor can there be. And at first, we didn't intend to do any studies. So we just, and when I say we, I mean my buddies from graduate school, Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski, we just thought these were interesting ideas. So we're like, oh, we're going to write a paper for the American Psychologist. And it was just saying, look, this Becker guy is interesting. And 6 months later, the paper was rejected with a single sentence review. I have no doubt that these ideas are of no interest whatsoever to any psychologist, alive or dead. And we were like, oh, that's not particularly encouraging. But what it came down to is that, in psychological discourse in the late 20th and now 21st century, ideas won't be taken seriously unless they can be empirically corroborated. Or I actually like how you put it a moment ago, unless you can prove them in the traditional sense of the word, which means to provide evidence that is not yet wrong, essentially. And so the first thing that we did was to just do some studies to show that self-esteem really does buffer anxiety. So we would raise self-esteem or leave it unaltered. And then we threaten people with electrical shocks, which sounds pretty gruesome, but it's a good way to make people aroused and anxious. And then we measured anxiety, both in terms of physiological arousal as well as self-report. And what we found is indeed, when you raise self-esteem, people are less aroused and less anxious. And that supports Becker's claim that self-esteem is essentially an anxiety buffer. And then what we did is to say, all right, but what about the more subtle and counterintuitive, perhaps, argument that that our beliefs serve to manage existential anxieties? And what we reasoned here, and in retrospect, it was pretty simple, but it took us a while to figure out how to proceed. We just said, okay, let's assume that he's right, that our beliefs serve to manage death anxiety. So how about if we bring people into the lab and we remind some of them that they're going to die? Literally, just ask them, hey, write down your thoughts and feelings about your own death. And then in control conditions, we ask people to write about something mundane, like listening to music, or something really negative but not fatal. You've been in a car crash and they have to chop off a leg. You're taking an exam. They have to yank a tooth and they don't have anesthetic. You're giving a speech in public and you vomit all over the people in the front row and they're not particularly pleased. All negative, but not fatal. And our argument is, well, if Becker's right, then when you're reminded of your own mortality, that should make you cling more tenaciously to your culturally constructed beliefs. And we should be able to determine that by measuring your reactions to other people who either share your beliefs or who are opposed to them or merely different from them. So, for example, in the first study that we did in the 1980s, we had municipal court judges either think about their own mortality or not. And then we asked them to assign a penalty for an alleged prostitute. And all we wanted to see, given that prostitution is considered morally reprehensible, at least in Arizona, we just wanted to see if that would affect the judge's decisions. And indeed it did. In the control condition, the average penalty was $50 US. And that's good because that was the average judgment in municipal court in those days. However, the judges reminded of their mortality. The average penalty was $455, which is not only statistically significant, but actually profound, 9 times more punitive. And maybe more profound is that when we talked to the judges and explained to them what we had done, every one of them said, look, I will tear your heart out of your chest and show it to you while it's still beating before you die, before I would admit that your stupid little death questionnaire would in any way influence the way that I adjudicate a legal procedure. And so we thought that was an incredibly strong test. And that basic finding has been replicated numerous times on lots of populations. That is, more punitive reactions to moral transgressions. But that wouldn't be all that interesting if the only thing that we demonstrated was that we are more negative when we're reminded of death. After all, death is a downer. So we turned right around and we did another study where we had people read a fictitious newspaper account of a citizen thwarting a bank robbery. And then we just said, well, how much reward should this person get? And in the control condition, it was about $1,000. In the mortality salient or death reminder condition, it was about $3,000. So this basic effect has been literally replicated hundreds of times. When you're reminded of death, you have more favorable reactions to people who behave in accord with your worldview. and more negative and punitive reactions to people who are opposed to them or merely different from them. And then we have one more paradigm, and then I'll shut up and we could talk some more. And that is, so now we know that self-esteem buffers anxiety. We know that when you're reminded that you're going to die, that this engenders what we call cultural worldview defense, and that goes in both directions. And so to kind of finish to the empirical circle, as it were, the next paradigm we said, okay, so if self-esteem and cultural belief systems, if they manage death anxiety, then let's see what happens if we threaten your beliefs or if we threaten your self-esteem, because that should bring death thoughts more readily to mind. And so we borrowed a technique from social and cognitive psychologists. It's just a simple word stem completion task. So imagine you're in a lab setting and you see the letters COFF blank blank, and your job's to make a word out of it. Well, if you've just passed a Starbucks, are they in Oxford yet? Hopefully not, but they're probably everywhere.
Yeah.
But anyway, you're more likely, even if you don't remember passing Starbucks, you might fill that word in as coffee. On the other hand, if you've just passed a morgue or a cemetery, you might fill that word in as coffin. And so we validated that measure by using subliminal death primes, which is flashing the word death for 48 milliseconds so fast that you can't even see that you've been exposed to it. And when we did that, we found that people would fill in more word stems with death-related words. Yeah, and so what we then did, and so we did some of these studies, and others people have done some of them too. But for example, Christian fundamentalists who are shown logical inconsistencies in the Bible, they have higher what we call death thought accessibility. If you, and this is, it operates in the secular realm. If you tell people who believe in the theory of evolution that the creationists might have a point, well, that makes their death thought accessibility go up. If you tell atheists that there may be a God, that makes their death thought accessibility go up. If you tell people that they've done poorly on an IQ test or that their personality is such that they might not be able to achieve their vocational goals, also death thought accessibility goes up. And then finally, what we've done is to show that if you increase self-esteem, that decreases or eliminates these other effects. And so if you raise self-esteem before you have somebody think about death, then they don't denigrate folks who are different or reward people who are the same. And ditto for the death thought accessibility. If you raise self-esteem first, it attenuates those effects. And so the bottom line is that we think, perhaps not surprisingly, but we're not the ones to judge, but we think that those three lines of convergent empirical inquiry provide a very potent empirical foundation for the central tenets of the theory.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that they're really robust. You mentioned briefly at the end there, you were talking about denigrating other people. So it's not just that we become more negative or become more positive. You also mentioned, you referred briefly to these social norms that we have, these cultural worldviews. So basically we reinforce the worldviews that we have. So in a sense, we're reinforcing our identity, right? We're reinforcing these worldviews that give us meaning. Like, why does this process of reinforcing these things happen? And then I think we should unpack a little bit, like the implications of that violence, right?
Yeah, very good. All right. Well, our view, based on Becker, is that it is the worldview and the self-esteem that we derive from it. That's what allows us to suppress thoughts of death. And as evidenced by the fact that when we threaten or weaken the worldview or self-esteem, death thoughts rise to the surface of consciousness, to use a metaphor. But good point, because basically, whenever I talk about Becker or terror management theory, this is as it should be. There's always two questions: so what, and how do we know if it's true? And I always try and address those questions simultaneously, although we already did the empirical paradigms. But, the first thing that we were interested in is, prejudice and ethnic and religious violence. I like how James Joyce puts it in Ulysses, because you're over in the UK. We're on the page 9, because nobody's ever finished the book, but we all started it. I did finish, but it took me 40 years. The main character says, history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. And our point is that, when you look at human history, even from a benevolent perspective, it's not a particularly pretty picture. It's one ongoing succession of genocidal atrocities, juxtaposed with the brutal subjugation of designated in-house inferiors. This raises the question of why. And that certainly things haven't changed that now. The only thing that's changed is we're in possession of weapons of mass destruction, that could reduce the earth to a smoldering heap. But Becker's response, and this is mostly in his last book, Escape from Evil, he says it's pretty simple, and he has two ideas that we find quite compelling. One is that if you take his claims seriously, then the mere existence of people who don't share your beliefs is fundamentally threatening. Because if you acknowledge the validity of somebody else's belief system, whether you're aware of it or not, you're undermining the confidence with which you subscribe to your own. So if I believe God created the earth in 6 days, as in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I run into the Fulani in Mali. They believe that the earth is created from a giant drop of milk. Well, if the dairy people in Africa are wrong, or if they're right, rather, then I must be wrong. And so that undermines my own terror management belief system. All right. Moreover, Becker says there's another problem, and that is that culturally constructed beliefs are quite powerful, but they're still ultimately symbolic, whereas death is ultimately a very real physical event. Consequently, he says, it's very lovely, although disconcerting language, he says, therefore, no belief system will ever completely eliminate death anxiety, and therefore there will be always a panic rumbling beneath the surface of consciousness. That's his phrase. And what he argues psychodynamically is that we take that residual death anxiety and we repress it. And then what we do is to project it onto other individuals that we declare the all-encompassing repositories of evil that, if eradicated, would make life on earth as we believe it to be in heaven. And so Becker's point is, it doesn't matter if you run into people who are different, or as Virginia Woolf said in A Room of One's Own, she's like, look, Will, if we don't have anybody different around to hate, we'll just declare somebody. She said, we'll hate people for the shape of their nose or the color of their shirt. Either way, what we do when we run into folks who are different is we denigrate them. We try to convince or compel them to dispose of their beliefs and adopt ours instead. And if that doesn't work, we just annihilate them, thus proving that our God and our beliefs is superior after all. And all right, so how do we know that that's true? Well, back to the lab. One of the first things we did in Arizona was a very simple study. Christian participants reminded of death or something unpleasant, who are then just asked to make judgments of other individuals in the room who identify either as Christian or Jewish. And what we find, the good news is in the control condition, no difference in evaluations as a function of religion. However, when reminded of death first, the Christian participants liked fellow Christians a whole lot more. and they hated Jewish people. And this has nothing to do with Christianity. So in Israel, Jewish people reminded of death. They love Jewish people. They hate Arabs and Christians. Indians in India reminded of death. They love Indians. They hate Pakistanis. That basic effect has been replicated by independent researchers in more than 25 countries on 5 continents. I say that not to boast, but to establish the robustness of the finding. But it's not only about attitudes. And so German participants reminded of their mortality. They sit closer to people who look German, and they sit further away from people who look like Turkish immigrants. Americans reminded of their mortality are literally more physically aggressive towards individuals who don't share their political beliefs. Iranians reminded of their mortality become more supportive of suicide bombers and more willing to become one themselves. I don't know about you, but I find that, again, profoundly, potentially disconcerting. To be glib and stupid for a moment, in America, people in the United States, we're not about to blow ourselves up, but we're happy to blow up other people. And so at the same time we were doing the study in Iran, we asked Americans to either think about death or something unpleasant. And then we just asked, how much do you support the use of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons against countries who do not presently threaten us? And the good news is, in the control condition, Americans said, fuck that, if you'll pardon the profanity. We're not big fans of the preemptive use of weapons of mass destruction. That's the good news. The bad news is that when they were reminded of their mortality first, then they're like, bomb them and then bomb the rubble. And this was particularly true of Americans who identified as conservatives. Now, I could talk much more about these things, but I like how George Bernard Shaw put it in I think it's a play, Heartbreak House, when Shaw says, when the angel of death sounds his trumpet, the pretenses of civilization are blown from men's heads into the mud like hats in a gust of wind. And, so we're not arguing that death anxiety can account for everything that we need to know about prejudice or ethnic conflict. We just insist that without considering the role of existential concerns, that you won't be in a position to understand these phenomena.
That's interesting. As I mentioned to you before we went live, I spoke with Eric Kuglansky recently, and he, I think, very wisely enfolded the concept of significance into his work on cognitive closure and understanding extremism. And I think there are definitely a lot of these sort of existentialist or death-related themes there in terms of attempting to establish some kind of security and significance in your cultural worldview, right? And so I'm wondering if you see a place for this sort of concern for uncertainty sort of being a part of this concern for your existential safety or trying to get rid of thoughts of death.
Great question. Now, if REA were here and all three of us were talking, first, I would agree with you. And second, I would give him a hard time, as I have over the decades, for, in a sense, appropriating the constructs that we've used and renaming them. And I'm making that argument not to be petty so much as I think it's confusing. His notion of personal significance we call self-esteem, and that's fine. But I do think it creates unnecessary confusion. And we're not that psychologists, though, are it's just our nature that we, in order to be personally significant, we want to name our own phenomenon. All right, be that as it may, you make a good point. There's been some very fine studies. We share students, and in the sense that some of our students have gone and worked with him, and vice versa. There's been some very fine work showing that his notions about uncertainty interact with our mortality salience paradigm. On the other hand, we take respectful issue with people, not REA, but some other folks who have said, well, what really bothers us about death, it's not really death, it's uncertainty in general. And we think that that's quite frankly silly. And the point that we make is, okay, so let's say that I told you, Stephanie, that right after we get done talking, I'm going to hop on a plane and I'm going to come to Oxford and I'll bring a gun and I will kill you tomorrow at noon. Well, now you're absolutely certain. Are you going to feel any better about that? And so our point is that if we were all literally immortal, that uncertainty would not bother us because it would be psychologically inconsequential.
Yeah, I like to think of it, I think, a little bit as a nexus of the two in terms of our inability to manage threats to our existence, right? And so sometimes uncertainty is a threat to our existence.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. We feel it as a threat, and death is always a threat, right? Or usually.
Yes, absolutely. In that sense, I agree entirely. And in fact, in that sense, like it or not, because it's true, we are perpetually uncertain by virtue of being, death is always potentially impending. Again, to be silly, we could get done talking and either of us can walk outside and get smote by a comet or, a disgruntled postal worker with a gun. That won't happen to you in the UK, but could happen over here. You could wake up with a headache and it's a golf ball sized malignant tumor. And so I think you're right. But our point, and we're kind of stubborn on this front, is to insist that conceptually it's death that is underlying all of these psychodynamic influences.
I just found a ladybug on my microphone.
Nice.
I was like, what is that? Okay. All right. So then my question is, and my question, I always ask this question. So then what do you think the sort of unique implications are for our modern world, right? I would infer that you think death has been central to human psychology for a very long time, but the way that we manage it has changed a lot over the years, right? Like hopes of heaven, I think, used to be a lot easier to access than they are now, right? And so has this been amplified in recent decades?
Well, yeah, I think so. And again, a great point. In some ways, we argue things have not changed in the sense of we're still driven by the same concern about not dying, and that the various manifestations of that concern are similar, but not entirely. So you make a good point. Nietzsche at the end of the 1800s says God is dead. But most people didn't read the rest of the paragraph where he says Christianity has become unbelievable. And his point, and he was remarkably insightful, he said it's going to take 200 years of chaos before humans, if we ever do, come to terms with that fact. And you're right, although the majority of people on Earth still believe in literal immortality, but it has declined in Western Europe, not in the US so much. But, instead of going to heaven, what's taken over is the prospect of not dying. We spend more money on cosmetics to at least look like we're not dying than we do on social services. There are people that take hundreds of probably not particularly effective vitamin supplements to extend their lifespan. You can get your head frozen for $70,000 after you die. So you could be reconstituted someday like the frozen burrito. Once we've developed the technology, people are working on having our identity uploaded to Google Cloud. And then you don't have to have this annoying carcass. Well, those are all thinly veiled death-denying strategies that are all ultimately probably doomed to fail. So that's one point, is that, but yet, we've been looking for fountains of youths and elixirs of immortality since antiquity. So that's not changed. Also, what's not changed is that, in times of historical crisis, when there's a lot of upheaval, people tend to embrace what the sociologist Max Weber called charismatic leaders, seemingly larger than life individuals who proclaim that they're singularly equipped, often by divine ordination, to keep people safe and to rid the world of evil. So when people ask me, well, so what? What can this help us explain that would be tough to otherwise? I'm like, well, it can help us explain Hitler and more recently the Orange Hitler, Donald Trump, and Brexit, and all of these populist movements. I say that not as a political diatribe, but as an empirical contention. So in 2001, President George W. Bush had the lowest approval rating in the history of presidential polling 2 days prior to September 11th. And then 3 weeks later, after he said, we will rid the world of the evildoers, and I believe that God has chosen me to lead the country at this perilous time, he has the highest approval rating. And sure enough, we did a bunch of studies showing that Americans all over the country did not think very highly of President Bush unless you reminded them of death first. And then they liked him a lot more. All right, well, fast forward to 2016, Donald Trump comes down the elevator and saying that, I'm going to save you. I'm going to save you from the hordes of Negrotinous brown people steaming across the southern border, where there's terrorists parachuting into Buffalo to steal our chicken wings and rape our daughters, and I'm the only one that can keep you safe. And it frankly didn't matter to half of the people in America. They were appalled. They're like, Trump is a vulgar, sadistic, vindictive, pathologically narcissistic, sociopathic, racist, xenophobic, homophobic, misogynistic, functionally illiterate, pussy-grabbing, cheese doodle impersonator. And they're like, this fucking guy is, just grotesquely ignorant, shockingly incoherent, and congenitally incapable of not lying. But to another half of America, they not only didn't mind that, they were enthralled by this kind of blustery, pseudo-successful business person claiming that he's going to keep us safe by making America great. Well, be that as it may, and again, if this sounds like a political diatribe, it's because it is. I consider him only slightly less dangerous than Hitler because he's lazier and less intelligent than Hitler. But the empirical point is that we did the same studies. And sure enough, in the control conditions, our participants liked Hillary Clinton more than Donald Trump. And they said they intended to vote for her more than they did Trump. All right, but if we reminded people that they're going to die first, then there's support for now President Trump increased dramatically.
Wow.
Moreover, we did other studies where we asked people to imagine a mosque being built in their town, or we asked people to imagine an immigrant moving into their neighborhood. And even if they were in neighborhoods where there were no Muslims or immigrants, that was enough to increase death thought accessibility. And that in turn increased American support for Donald Trump. And so Trump doesn't need to remind people of death at his rallies or flash the word death on his website subliminally, although who knows. But all he needs to do is to constantly rant about immigrants and terrorists, which is precisely what he now does. So I don't see, and I think Brexit is the same. I think that in Europe right now, the popularity of populist leaders is the same. Those are all driven by existential concerns. And so that would be another area where I think it's important to consider these ideas. Another one is just our alienation from nature and contempt for the environment. When we remind people that they're going to die, they deny that humans are animals, and they become more hostile to animals and more willing to kill them for reasons other than food and medical research. People reminded of death are more uncomfortable in nature as opposed to humanly altered environments, and they're more willing to greedily exploit non-renewable natural resources. So we think even there, it's like, okay, we're not saying that, once again, that this explains everything, but it explains a lot. Ditto for how come people spend most of their time either drinking or shopping. I like Tennessee Williams and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. He said, what was it? He said, "Oh, the human animal is a beast that dies, and if he's got money, he buys and he buys and he buys." And I think the reason that he buys everything that he can buy is in the back of his mind, he thinks that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. And so again, we just do studies, or other people do them. You remind people of death and you ask how much money would it take for you to feel rich, and they say they need more money. When you remind people of death, they want more stuff. Not practical stuff like a toaster. They want luxury items like a Lexus or a Porsche. You remind people that they're going to die, and they consume more. They eat more cookies. They drink more alcohol. They smoke more cigarettes. You remind people that they're going to die and ask them to draw pictures of what money looks like in their country, and they draw bigger pictures. It's like money looms larger on our minds when we're thinking about death. And then my favorite one, done by some Polish researchers, they gave some Polish participants a stack of money to count, and in the control condition, they gave people just a stack of paper to count. And you don't get to keep the money. You just had it in your hands for a minute. And then they measured death anxiety. And sure enough, just counting money was sufficient to reduce death anxiety. For me, this is one of the most important implications of this work, is because, you know, the prevailing view in economics is that money's just an abstract symbol that is used rationally as an exchange of goods and services. All right, but that's never been true, and it's certainly not true today. And in the US, I just say, well, turn over a dollar bill where it says, "In God we trust." And then there's a little picture of a pyramid with a disembodied eye on the top, which Joseph Campbell tells us is an ancient symbol of immortality. So money's always had religious significance. And then the last thing, and then you get back to more questions, we think that these ideas are critical to explain why there's epidemic levels of psychopathology in many Western industrialized societies. That, depression 10 times higher in the US right now than it was at the end of World War II. And so there's two things. One thing is that according to Becker, whenever people are struggling, you got to look at the prevailing values to see if they're realistically attainable by the average individual. And his point is that they're not. We value money and power. We value standards of physical beauty, particularly for women, that are not realistically attainable. And when people fall short of those ideas, that undermines their self-esteem. And so that's one element of this. And then the other is that some existential psychologists insist that what underlies a host of psychological disorders are existential anxieties. And so we and others have done a boatload of studies where we remind often clinical populations of individuals of their mortality and find that it magnifies those symptoms. So snake phobics become more afraid of snakes, and OCD people reminded of death wash their hands more and use more soap. Socially anxious people hide in the closet more. Dissociated people reminded of death report higher levels of psychological dissociation, and so on. So we think that, and there's other areas that these ideas have been applied to, but we think those are some of the big ones that are of current concern that would be hard to understand otherwise.
Mm. Yeah, something that I think is really interesting about this whole discourse is, you know, we have these studies, you have these studies, have done these studies, and you remind people of death in either an implicit or an explicit way, and we can point to these. And I think it's easy for people to say, oh, and you mentioned earlier, people say, oh, I don't think about death that much. And people say that sort of thing to me all the time. But is it not true that we can also, again, as sort of a complement to this discussion about pathologies, right, and mental illnesses, we encounter our mortality all the time.
That's right.
Right? Like seeing wrinkles when we look in the mirror, or tripping when we walk down the street. There's kind of all day, every day, we're reminded of how fragile our existence is.
That's right. And once again, yeah, our argument is that most of us are able to stand up in the morning and make it through the day because of the anxiety buffering properties of our worldviews and the self-regard that we get from them. And it's so, yeah, so I'm fine as I'm walking to work thinking about the next weighty tome that I'm going to write. And I freely, though not cheerfully, admit that this work is an intellectual defense that enables me not to be constantly perseverating about the fact that the meter's running and I'm one step away from the abyss. But what some argue, and I think that they're right, is that folks who have psychological disorders, and this is an Otto Rank point, one of Freud's boys, and Rank said, oh, you know, we think of people with psychological problems as deluded, and those of us that are nearly normal, we're seeing things realistically. And he's like, no, that's exactly backwards. Those of us that we proclaim to be normal look like we're doing pretty well precisely because we're adequately deluded, whereas those who have psychological labels are either unable or unwilling to partake of the culturally constructed view of life that our culture affords us, and therefore they're riddled with concerns about their mortality that then manifest in a variety of ways.
Yeah, so arguably then, one of the things we can do to help ourselves be less anxious or what have you is build a healthy sense of self-esteem, right, of being valuable in our communities. But I also think it's important when we do this to not go the route. I think we have a very thin, tenuous route right now, which is taking a lot of selfies and putting them on Facebook. But I don't think that that's actually going to be the kind of healing sense of self-esteem that could actually be functionally beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. And well put. Self-esteem is not the same as narcissism.
Mm.
And and you know, almost in I don't in my half-ass misunderstanding of Buddhism and, you know, the Eastern traditions, yeah, if you have genuine self-regard, then you're not preoccupied with yourself, nor is it necessary to document every step that you take and upload it on your Facebook page. And so I think that you're right. We have to make a careful distinction between narcissism and self-esteem. And this is easy enough to do conceptually and empirically, because if you're a legend in your own mind, you can be pretty sure that that's narcissism. But moreover, you know, there are explicit and implicit measures of self-esteem. And we know that people with genuine self-esteem score high on both measures. Mm. Whereas narcissists, they're off the scale on explicit self-esteem, but they score very low on implicit self-esteem. So we know that beneath their kind of blustery self-confidence resides massive insecurity. And that's why they constantly need to surround themselves with folks that help prop up what turns out to be a very insecure sense of themselves.
Mm. And so I really like that. That's very insightful. So what else can people do? I really liked something that you said in your book, The Worm at the Core, about choosing to be in a hard place instead of having a rock to stand on. You know, we usually say we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and we mean they're the same, but you mean that they're different, and that you have to sort of cultivate a comfort with ambiguity. But I think that's way easier said than done. Like, how do people actually enter into a space where they are somewhat comfortable with their ephemerality?
Yeah. Okay. So to be silly, great question. If I can answer it, I'd be chugging rum out of a coconut with my Nobel Prize on a beach instead of wallowing through hip deep snow, because I do think you've captured it. I mean, we borrowed the term, you know, rock in a hard place because of that phrase, because we do think that people are stuck between a rock and a hard place. So when we talk about the rock, we mean, you know, rigid fundamentalist views that, on the one hand, give people comfort because they explain everything. So fundamentalist religion would be one view. Being an accolade or acolyte of somebody like Donald Trump would be another. Just cult-like affiliation with a leader who you rely on to make all of your decisions. So is a belief in a free market economy, the idea that the invisible hand, if we just do nothing and let everybody else be selfish, that's going to help all of us. These are all very simple and ultimately simple-minded belief systems, but they're very powerful psychologically in that they address all questions and in so doing tend to mitigate death anxiety. But they do so at a great cost, and that is overt hostility and disdain for alternative belief systems. And so on the other hand, and as you already put it, then we've got what we call the hard place. And these are kind of, you know, Kierkegaardian takes on life, which is that you step back and you realize that, wow, no cultural construction has a lock on the truth. And life is fundamentally ambiguous. And this doesn't mean that I'm going to be paralyzed by indecision so much as I'm going to have a confident a regard for my current beliefs, while at the same time humbly recognizing that other people have a right to theirs, and that I may be wrong. And our view is that, well, that stance towards life is probably more accurate. It's certainly more ecumenical. I think that the world would be a lot better in 5 minutes if we could all adopt that view. All right, but one does so at the expense of psychological equanimity, because it puts you in a permanent state of dis-ease, not disease. Put a hyphen between dis and ease. And honestly, I think, that is the most significant question that one could pose. And I applaud the question in light of these ideas. And it shows that you've clearly have a great command of them. It's like, can we hit that psychological sweet spot? Can both personally and socially, can we come up with durable belief systems that confer adequate levels of meaning and self-regard, while not ultimately taking its toll on others, other cultures, and other people in our own? And yeah, let me know when you figure that one out.
I'm honestly I'm working on it. Maybe I'll have a coconut and a Nobel in a couple decades. I really, after a lot of conversations with people about these sorts of things, I really do think that healthy senses of self-esteem are important, and having a value system that you think is real and not necessarily relativistic, right? And
absolutely,
and placing yourself within that, and also like having a culture that values open-mindedness, and then you can like it so much that the dis-ease is more bearable, and your self-esteem helps cushion that. But also, again, that's a challenging thing to do, but I will continue to work on it. I'll let you know how it goes.
No, do let me know. And you might want to chat with Michelle Gelfand. She's at the University of Maryland, and it's very interesting and pleasant, but also does super important work, because I think she calls her concept open and closed cultures. And apropos of what you just said, Stephanie, she shows that there are cultural differences with regard to how open people are to other belief systems. And it intersects very nicely with some of the things that we've spoken about today.
Okay, I will shoot her an email. We're coming up on an hour, so you are free to go. I'm free to let you go. I'm wondering if you have any other things you'd like to say, or any questions or ideas you want to,
Well, no, only one thing, and that is, I don't even know how to say it. No, I'll say it straight up. Thanks for doing this. I have been watching some of your other segments, and they're wonderful. And I'm saying that not to inflate your self-regard, but to claim that you're at the vanguard of where I think we need to be heading. Specifically, that these are, I believe, to be important ideas, and our work is fine, and the 200 people on Earth that know about it from our technical articles are, that's a good thing. But Ernest Becker said in his last book, I wish there was some way that everybody on Earth was exposed to these ideas. And how do we get them injected into public discourse? And it's not going to be eggheads like me writing another non-pharmacological intervention for insomnia. It's going to be, honestly, it's going to be young folks like you that have the academic background to recognize a good idea when they bump into it, but to have the savvy and ambition to put these notions into play. And so I just really applaud the effort. You're getting a PhD. You have a lot of other things that you could do, like hiding in the library.
Yeah, it's tempting. It's tempting.
Yeah. So anyway, I applaud what you're doing. I wish you well, and you know how to find me if it can ever be of use.
I do, and I appreciate obviously you saying that very much. It's hard because
It is hard.
these ideas are complex, and so it's intrinsically a challenging task. But I think Becker is absolutely right, and so I promise that I will not give up on the ambition. So
Very good. That's great.
yeah. Well, I kind of have to now. Since I'm not going to be in academia, I have no choice. So here I go.
Oh, there you go. Well, you have a good future, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out to me with anything that I could possibly do or whatever. So.
All right, I'll do that. All right. Thanks for talking and have a great day.
Yeah. Thank you, Sheldon. Thank you a lot.
Bye now.